Hello and welcome.
All right, we're rolling okay. Hey, welcome back to the Church of Mark. We have a very special episode today talking about what it means to be Indigenous, and we have some esteemed guests with us. First, I'll tell you about my background. My family's roots go to the Chippewas and Awash up in Cape Croker, which is just a little bit north of Owen Sound. Although my mother was born and raised in Wikwemicon, Wiki for short, located on Manitoulin Island. And now I'll let our esteemed guests introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Mike. Although I guess I just technically introduced you, calling you Mike.
Ani bojo debre indishnakas ashkikamang andojaba makwa dodem. My English name is Mike. I am from Curve Lake or Ashkikamang. Well, my family is. I was born here in Toronto and raised north of the city. And yeah, I'm just really honored to be here. But this is the lady you should have started.
Yeah, okay. Yes, please. Shannon.
Nadal Willawan. Hello. My name is Wasmayin Samti Hannah. In English, that is Misty Morning Thunderbird. I was born in a crashing thunderstorm. And my name is Shannon Thunderbird. And yes, that really is my last name. And no, I was not named after a car. It is one of the questions that I get asked. Were you named after a car? And I really have to say, wait a minute. I was here first. The car was named after me.
That's right.
I like that.
I am Coast Chibchayan First Nation. My reserve is basically between Prince Rupert and Terrace, British Columbia. But I've been in Ontario. I don't even want to count the decades, but I've been here for a very long time.
Great. Welcome. Jules, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. It's K.J. McCusker. I'm adopted into an Irish family, hence the Irish name. My running joke, going into Irish pubs as a kid was you can't have a more Irish name than I do. To mind yourself now. My father comes from Fort Simpson, a Dene community up on the Mackenzie River. And my grandfather found my grandmother. Yeah, Fort Simpson. Yeah. My grandfather found my grandmother up in Inuvik and brought her down. And between the two of them, I think they had like 3 or 4 partners, like children with 3 or 4 different partners between the two of them. So there's about 100 of us, I guess, up there.
Okay, wow. There's 100. Okay.
So I'm of the original grouping. So that was their first groups of children were my grandma and grandpa, and then they both had children afterwards with other partners.
Okay.
And I was born in Edmonton, raised in Calgary. So I was born grew up surrounded by Indians. In that town teaches you native life in a different way, especially racism and all the sort of things. And it's kind of touches on the subject that we're going on today, right? The
That's
confrontation of settlers taking our identity or first our land.
Got it.
That's it. That's in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I guess maybe let's get the elephant out of the room because everyone that's tuning in the show will want to know what our opinion is, of course, on the whole Buffy situation. There's even virtual circles that have already happened. You've participated in 1 or 2, is that correct, Mike? 2, okay. And they're continuing on until, I think, the end of this week. Is that correct?
Tuesday and Thursday this week.
Okay. I noticed today, just before we started taping, I was going to try to log on or see if I could get in today's session, but it's already sold out.
Yeah.
So they have, I guess, a maximum number of participants.
So it's a Zoom type of thing, and I guess there's only a certain. Although if you get a hold of like Leela or somebody, they can get you in. I know that.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll do that. All right, I'll pull my connections.
I can pull tabs for you if you want.
Okay, thank you so much. So So, who wants to weigh in on the whole Buffy, I guess, controversy that's going on now? Personally, I mean, I did watch the special. I did read all the documentation, and I am a reasonable person. I can put two and together, and the evidence shows that she is not Indigenous. In fact, that she has been kind of masquerading in this identity. Race shifting, I guess I believe is the term now people say. So that's my own personal view. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I also, as I'm sure a lot of people have, I've watched the Fifth Estate documentary. I watched it on YouTube when it first came out that Friday. I've watched it a few times since then, just to clarify a few things. When I first heard the news that there was something coming up, there was an article that basically outlined everything that CBC was going to be discussing. I think it was in Indian Country News or something like that. And I read that and went, yeah, okay. And then I watched the video that Buffy put out, where she ends by saying, "I know who I am, and I know who loves me," and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And that just doesn't help.
No.
Right. Just doesn't.
And it was sort of very vague. So
it did.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, when I first saw it, I have to admit, I was like, like I was still kind of like trying to lift up that whole scenario, because I mean, she was somebody that has been important in our circles, right? And then I watched the Fifth Estate series, and then I went back and I watched the video again, and my opinion has changed. Like yourself, I can put two and two together. I mean, I know there's been a lot of debate over everything from, including the birth certificate, but the birth certificate that they found has a doctor's signature on it who delivered her sister.
That's right.
And has a date and a time, and I'm not sure you go to that extent.
Yeah, and more importantly, there's a signature of a live birth.
Yeah.
Versus if it was an adoption.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And now she's coming out. I mean, she's come back with another statement, and it was really vague too. And also, made some comments about, she's now claiming she doesn't know who her parents were, yet at one time she claimed she did. Years ago, she claimed that she was Algonquin, then Mi'kmaq, then part Mi'kmaq, and then all of a sudden Cree.
Right.
Those are red flags for anybody that's been following the pretend Indians that we have had a run of in the last few years. Did I expect this? No. Far from it. I mean, it
was kind of shocking, right?
I don't think it's made it even worse by winning that international Emmy a few days ago.
Oh, that's
and
right.
It's just thrown more matches onto the fire, and the outrage is just enormous that she won. That was a big award, didn't she?
It was a big award, and I see that there's further division being caused by this subject in our community. Even just within 24 hours of the Fifth Estate special being aired, you already saw the comments and people taking, I guess, their own sides, hunkering down, I guess, in their own camps on the subject.
It's just hard to. I mean, we basically all grew up with her, So, and you knew her as one thing. I think the real there's a lot of tragedy in this, but she's 82, going on 83, and this is now what she's going to be, damned for. Right. And I have regret with that. I have having had my 77th birthday, I understand just, at this point in my life or in her life, that must be just heartbreaking.
What a way to end a legacy or end your life.
Yeah, thank you. I was running out of words because she's ended her, she will come to the end of her life, and that is what she will be remembered for.
That's right.
So...
Well, I think there's a simple solution, but I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, quite frankly, my view is if she is who she claims to be, and, our people and our community are so important to her, whether you want to do it or not, take the DNA test, prove who you are. That's not going to happen because she's not going to do it. Right. But that would certainly silence this division. And I think, what you were talking about is certainly, it's grown in the last month or so that this has been out. And that to me is what's more alarming is the division. You've got an organization that's supposed to support 60 Scoop, and they're supporting her. She's one of us.
That's just devastating.
But then there's people that are 60 Scoops that are like totally alienated by the fact that she claimed to be a Scoop and
the stories don't measure out
and
at
it's
all.
just
That is just...
I mean, that's the part. It's
that's
like,
just beyond conscience, good conscience.
Right.
That just is...
No, it's bone chilling because I'm a Scoop and it's and I'm not really for the whole sort of like Scoops joining forces on anything. However, there is a dilemma there. It's real, and I struggle with that idea that you just you poach something that some people in my category, their lives are ruined because of being Scoops. Their lives are just drugs, alcohol, and graveyards, And I was fortunate to be raised by a really hard-handed Irishman who raised me with a very high tension level for intensity. So I just grew up with a different way of looking at alcohol, different way of looking at trauma. And I just never let it bug me. I never let that trauma bug me. But you see people that she's leveraging these traumas, and then the worst of it is that none of them measure against facts. She says my grandparents, in an interview, my grandparents went to residential school. Well, how could your grandparents, you were born in, when she's 83 years old, your grandparents would have been in the 1700s, and there wasn't a residential school in Saskatchewan in the 1700s.
The first one anywhere was in 1831. That was the first one.
I know. And it's
so how's that work?
Like 1831, not even the old man Payapot, the original chief, not even those kids, those Payapot's kids didn't even go to residential school. Right. So it's just like that. So you're saying your grandparents, your parents, and your aunties and siblings have gone to residential. It's outrageous. It's just totally. So that part just kills me.
I think we have to. The other part of this discussion that we have to touch on is the fact that, and you mentioned the Payapot family. She has been ceremonially adopted into the Payapot family. There were members of the Payapot family that did go through the residential school. So that's maybe what she was referring to. But I think there are some people within our community, whether it be Indigenous music or just the Indigenous community as a whole, that say, well, she was adopted traditionally, ceremonially, they accept her, so therefore she is.
Family member. She's a family member.
Yeah. And we had this discussion earlier before we were on air. There's a woman by the name of Michelle Good, who's a Cree writer, Plains Cree from Saskatchewan, raised just down the road and is a member of a reserve just down the road from the Payapots. Her take on it is that she respects Cree law. She respects that those things are, that family has the right to kinship with her because of the adoption. However, if Buffy does not have Indigenous blood, she's not Indigenous. And the way she looked at it was an analogy that she used using a definition from the Audubon Society on plants. There's 3 classes of plants. There are Indigenous plants that have always been here. There are naturalized plants that came from somewhere else and then became accepted into the ecosystem that's here. And then there's the invasive species, which are trying to take over. They're from somewhere else and trying to take over. And what Michelle said was, if she does not have any Indigenous blood, the best she is naturalized. And I accept that. The other side of the coin, and maybe this is something that, maybe we can transition, because this is an important discussion. I don't want to make little of it, but I think at some point we need to move on. My wife is Plains Cree in Finnish, and her remark on Facebook is, Buffy has to wake up every morning with knowing what she is. Right. And it really doesn't matter to us, because we're going to survive. We're going to go on. As somebody else said, there are bigger fish to fry. We've got problems with substance abuse and housing and water and all of those things. And really, the division that this is causing is more of a concern to me. The lateral violence, the divide and conquer mentality. And I think, and there's also, and no offense to anyone that's not Indigenous, but there's been too many of them having their say on this as well. I think we need to just, she was a great musician. She created a platform where she did some things that certainly supported our people. Did she do that to build up her career? Only she knows that. Is she who she claims to be? Only she knows that, and her creator, as far as I'm concerned. I think there are things that came from this, though, that we need to reflect on, and that is the whole issue of identity. We've seen this in other arts forms with the Michelle Latimers and the Joseph Boydens, and even going back further when we had people like, Grey Owl, for God's sake.
Grey Owl, I was just going to say.
And, and the weird thing about Grey Owl is there were the Indigenous people at that time didn't really have a voice. I mean, we didn't have any voting.
Plus, he was an invention of his wife. So his Ojibwe wife was the one who said, you need to go and do this. A lot of people forget this about Grey Owl. Grey Owl was 100% invented by his full-blooded Indigenous wife, who thought that this guy needs to be a voice. He needs to be able to speak to the white people and tell them that these disasters need to slow down. And I consider her to be probably one of the first environmental crusaders that we've ever had, like a first land protector. You'd have to look her up and find out more about her, but she invented Grey Owl.
Just to clarify,
because nobody was going to listen to her.
Most people don't know that she was invented by an Indian, and a woman created that.
Just to clarify, he actually had already, before they met, she's Mohawk, by the way, not Ojibwe. He had an Ojibwe wife. He was up in the Temagami area, became acquainted with people from Bear Island. They taught him how to live off the land, how to travel, how to do those things. He actually wrote several short stories which were published in England, where he's from, and he did some stories at a hotel. And you're right, she did encourage him to continue that, but he'd already taken on that role. She just encouraged him to do it on a bigger scale.
Right, because there's three wives involved, right?
There's actually
I'm thinking
4.
Of the first one. The fourth one is the one where he died with that family, right?
That was the Mohawk woman. The first wife was Anishinaabe. She was from Bear Island, but I mean,
that's the one I believe that invented her.
Maybe, you could be right,
because she was said to be like 100% land woman, hunted, trap, everything. She lived and breathed on the land.
That could be,
but that's. Yeah,
I know
but it is an interesting confluence, right? Where
really
did that
is.
origin story come from?
I mean, we ended up with Pierce Brosnan playing, which was
that's right.
Which
is pretty to see that film.
Yeah,
yes, I know. Yes, that's true.
And the weird thing is, there was a few of us that got hired to teach him how to paddle a canoe, which was really bizarre. But anyway, that's another story.
Yeah.
But I don't want to take up. I don't want to be the only voice heard here. I am half Ojibwe, half Irish, so I'm a gibberish, so let's get that one out. But, we've had, there's been so much going on in the last few years, I mean, even around adoption. I mean, Joseph Boyden was adopted by Cree families up in the north. yet he's not who he claimed to be. From my reserve, a distant cousin who's a playwright, Drew Hayden Taylor, just did a documentary called Pretend Indians.
Right.
The other side of the coin is that a lot of people are attacking CBC for like this expose they did on her and how they did it and all that stuff.
I'm not sure why they're attacking a news outlet that reports the news, right?
And even more so, why would you attack the CBC when really they're the ones that built her up over all the years? Recently they did that celebration of her life at the National Arts Center that included a lot of artists that we're friends with or know. There were a podcast that Phelan Johnson did that was several parts. That was an incredible, they've had her on a lot of different shows. So I don't think the CBC really deliberately went out to, knock her down. But, I think,
They also have a reputation to keep.
Yeah, and
I think they were duped along with everybody else. So, and they're a news organization. So
that's right. Yeah.
Let's report the news. That's what they do.
And they are thorough.
Yeah,
they are. They have yet to fail any fact checks, especially the Fifth Estate.
Absolutely, yeah. The CBC really, they are extraordinarily on task when it comes to these kinds of stories. So
one could argue the bias in the reporting. Of course, they lean left a lot, but but factually they do present the facts. Yeah.
Well, because it's a dramatic story.
Right.
It's dramatic. Yeah. So here is this icon, an international icon, and suddenly just gone from here to here, and so there's this. It's hard not to, I think, to report it in a rather dramatic way because it's just extraordinary.
And they have all the inconsistencies in their own material.
Yeah.
They have all the interviews going back to the beginning. Right?
That's right.
But they did the job, and it's what our Canadian broadcasting is supposed to do, so they did it.
I get blown away by the fact that she's not a Canadian, but in all these Canadian, what are the terms for some of these awards? If you're going to be going up for the Order of Canada,
you have to be a Canadian citizen. Last time I checked, that's right. Yeah.
So what? Yeah, I don't quite understand. I mean, I get that they were trying to. I mean, and this is an interesting thing, and you guys were touching on it before our conversation started. But there's this notion, and I'm glad generationally we're kind of separated a little bit by 30 years, and because the work your generation did to get, and the generation just before you, to get into law, right? Into law, because I think I was probably 18 or 19 years old when non-status rights became real, because it was being pushed through the 70s, and then self-determination became real by law, right? And this is what you brought up earlier about well, we're the only group of people that need to validate or prove who we are, and that was where self-determination came in, because it was messing this entire group of disenfranchised Indians who really didn't know where they were in that, in that landscape, and it was your generation that did the work to push it into law. And now, we've been seeing 30 years of backlash of that a little bit. Like, we're seeing all this opportunism, and I didn't know, because this is the weird part, because that generation, our generation, I'm 50, come from a place where people didn't really want to be Indians. Like, there weren't people jumping out. Hey, there was a handful of them. I mean, we always saw them at powwows and stuff, right? Like, you'd see a handful of people like dressed up in makeup and trying to put on regalia and join in on a powwow. But for the most part, you didn't see in mass or anything like that. But now, places like services, like Anishinaabe Health and so forth. Now, I used to be able to walk in there without any ID, because I would just on face value, they know who I am, and they won't let people go in like that anymore. You've got to have either your status card or your Métis membership card or your Inuit, some kind of identity that they can identify you and give you the services, because so many people were checking off the box of self-identified Indian, right?
And it's interesting you say that, sort of to jump in there. I was reviewing some data, the last census in the U.S., I think from 2010 to 2020, the people that are identifying as Indigenous have doubled.
Yeah, and and that was where, like, I was going to bring up when you guys were talking about this earlier, was Newfoundland's a perfect case study to that.
That's right. Yeah,
because Newfoundland, they don't actually have an Indigenous body group, and I don't. This is an interesting thing, because you bring up the DNA thing and the study and stuff like that. Well, how many people in that Newfoundland new First Nation are really Indigenous, but when they made the application to become recognized, I think there was only like 8. I don't know what the real numbers are, but like 800 people or something like that.
Oh,
now it's like 5,000.
It's very, very small. I was out in Newfoundland for a couple of weeks last year touring, and it was just astonishing how much they didn't know.
Right.
And I thought, well, is it because it's an island? It's got to separate. But it's how, and we did, my sister and I, we did a teacher's professional development day. And and they were trying to teach Indigenous studies of some sort, but it was just shocking what they didn't know. Just shocking,
right? They're just making things up, right?
Well, but they're looking on the web, and there's so much incorrect information on the web that you kind of take it as gospel. Which is why I started building my website 20 years ago as an accurate teaching website.
Right. Which is like curriculum development, which is massive amount of work.
But we had, I create PowerPoint presentations, and one of the things that I took with me was basically Indigenous Studies 101. Basically, okay, a long time ago, guess what? We were here, and that we're not Indians, actually. Can't be if we weren't born there, but that's a whole other story. It's not my fault Columbus had a lousy sense of direction. And the thing that really ticks me off about that is that he never came to North America. He never set foot on North American soil. Right. He went down to the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which he called Hispaniola, and he never came here, which is why I've never understood why, the States would have Columbus Day when nobody came. You see, this kind of...
It's a whole.
The history is just not
story of origin,
skewed,
mythology,
skewed completely.
Yeah.
And so it was.
We weren't even Indians before that. We were referred to as the Americans.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Because they're a melting pot, right?
That's how they took our identity. That's the first Indian. That's our first identity theft.
First identity theft.
But even so, Americans tend to go. Cuban American, Black American. British American. They always have the American on there. And people, you weren't around for a very long time. How can you do these things? But it was just an interesting day that I spent with these teachers who were just so shocked when they were watching the PowerPoint and residential schools. And Lord, I've just finished one on truth and reconciliation in the residential schools PowerPoint, and you have to be very brave to sit there and watch this because it is the unvarnished truth on Canada's war on children, and. I've shown it a couple of times, and it's been very hard for natives to watch it because it's heartbreaking. But for non-natives, it's what? Really?
Right.
And there's so much more in that,
speaking of disconnect, this division. There is that division between knowing the truth and. Finding out all this other big stuff. You see, I am referred to as a truth teller, which is a tough gig because when you're telling truth. A lot of people don't want to hear it.
No, they don't.
You
That's
know,
for sure.
and don't get me started on the rewriting of Indigenous history on the role of women. We don't want to go there right now, but that's a whole other podcast. But
Yes. That'll
Uh,
be a special on next week. So tune in.
yeah, well, I mean, seriously. Okay, I opened the door and I'm going to shut it now because I am not I'm not a popular Indigenous elder when it comes to my absolute unwavering support of Indigenous women and their role in the Indigenous communities. So, you know, it all kind of changed after the Second World War.
But I think what Shannon's talking about, and sorry to interject, but I think it's important that we talk about that truth. My Anishinaabe name that I was given by the late Elder Art Solomon is Debwe, which means speaks truth. So if you don't want the answer, don't ask me.
Don't ask me.
Right.
That's what I say. Don't ask me if you don't want to hear the truth.
But if you look at the definition of that word in Anishinaabe Moen, you know, it's interesting because they say that, you know, I have a right to my opinion. You have a right to your opinion. You have your truth. I have mine. And there's almost no absolute truth. There is something in between those two truths. They may differ. We may agree.
Sure.
But we may differ. And yet, having said that, you know, when it comes to non-Indigenous people, it's cut and dry. It's like, you know, I'll share a quick story.
Sure.
I was at a concert at Massey Hall a week ago Saturday.
What was the concert?
It was Chest Fever. It was the last waltz. It was not the greatest concert in there.
Okay.
It was okay, but a band trying to be too much like the band. But
dear.
But they had people like Colin Linden and
Okay.
Sylvia Tyson and people like that. So it was cool. But the weird part was that I was sitting next to a very non-Indigenous, pigmentally challenged individual. How's that? Is that fair? And he happened to start talking to me because we were sitting right next to each other. And he said, we started talking about Massey Hall and, you know, how they've refurbished it and restored it and how great it is. And I'm like, yeah, it's really cool. He said, yeah, the first concert I saw here was Buffy St. Marie. And I said, yeah, I saw Buffy. I saw that concert. That was my first concert back in the new Massey Hall. And he said, he looked at me, he said, so, like, are you Indigenous? I said, well, yeah, actually I am. What part? I'm like, well, that's an odd question, but
What part?
I said, well, I'm actually half Irish, half Ojibwe.
Well, you didn't say geographically the part?
No. And then he goes,
my left arm? Is that what you're saying?
and then he asked the question.
Okay.
So what do you think of Buffy? And I'm like, well, actually, I'd rather not comment because it's probably not going to go very well. And he said, well, you know, she did so much for your people, and I don't understand. And, like, just rattled off all this stuff. And I went, well, if she's not who she claims to be, then she's a fraud. And he goes, you can't say that. I said, well, actually, I just did, so I can. And you could see his wife was really uncomfortable.
Wow.
Because the next thing out of his mouth is, well, my people have always been here.
Oh, dear.
And I said,
Oops.
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, what is wrong with that?
Where's your family? Like, what's your background? Well, I'm Scottish, Irish, German. I said, so in other words, your family, your roots are from somewhere else. Well, so are yours as an Indigenous person. And I said, oh, you're going to use the Bering Strait?
Right.
I knew you were going to say that because I was going to say
And I
it.
went,
One of my favorite
according
topics.
to my stories, the traditional
The Bering
stories
myth.
I was told, we've always been here.
Yeah.
Right? And I said, so
loves you best,
I don't
Mike?
know, we're the original peoples. You know, so there is that whole, you know, like, and as I think I said earlier,
I can't believe the story just escalated.
oh, it just,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
It's like,
I think it's been fueled more by non-Indigenous people as well. It's like, I think non-Indigenous people latch onto things.
They do. It feels like they always have to voice
Yeah.
their opinion where it's not always required.
The one rule I never make is anything on online media, any story that is Indigenous related, like even the lacrosse story about
Right.
the Haunishonees could have a lacrosse team in the next Olympics because it's a sport in the next. And they always have, usually they have comments. Don't ever read the comments because they are the most racially racist, bigoted.
It's fascinating, yeah.
But on the Buffy story, comments closed. Could not comment on any of them. So I posted that. I said, how come? Like, why is this happening? And the stuff that I got back on Facebook, you're attacking Buffy. I didn't. I just asked, how come we're not allowed to comment on it? I didn't say
That's
to
right.
A fraud.
I mean, if you've read anything I've said on Facebook, it's like, can we just shut the hell up and move on?
That's right.
Or let Indigenous people figure it out. Give us time to digest this, because I think that's been the biggest problem.
The divide, the cultural divide, is so huge. Not just with Indigenous people, and let me tell you a quick story.
Sure, yeah. Please.
I was in a Subway sandwich store 4 or 5 days ago, and I was meeting my sister down. She's a costume designer, and I was getting lunch at Subway, and I was meeting her down at her studio for lunch, and it's run by 2 Muslim women, and which a lot of the Subway stores are. I mean, they have a lot of visible minorities, making businesses for themselves and, employers. Hello. And this guy standing beside me, and he said, I don't know, there was just something that put me on alert. I'm very sensitized, right? Because I will always remember my trip to Tim Hortons, but that's another story.
Okay.
And he said, are you Muslim? And the 2, they were young, right? They were youngish women. And I turned to him. You don't say that when I'm in the room. And I turned to him and said, well, I'm First Nations, which means I was here first. Who the hell are you? And he shut down. And the 2 women were just, they suddenly started shaking. They thought they were going to be harmed just by that very aggressive lean across the counter and go, are you Muslim? And I just said, I'm First Nations. I don't know if they're Muslim. I didn't ask. Why are you asking? And I said, obviously, you are a complete moron, and I think that you ought to be leaving the store immediately because they don't need your money and because they don't need the hassle you're about to give them. He left. I had to wait for a few minutes because I wasn't sure if he knew what car I was driving.
Okay.
Like, I'm not stupid.
Right.
But it was just, anyway, I turned around to the 2 of them and I said, how do you say, have a nice day in your language? So they taught it to me.
Oh, okay.
So we now are, having an exchange. And, oh my God, people. That's a small little, thing, but it's worldwide. We have so much rage and anger in this world. We can't even go into a Subway store and not have somebody challenge in that very, very awful way. They just can't do it in front of me. I just won't have it. I won't have it. And I've had these encounters before when it's not with me, but it's with somebody else. And, no.
Well, it's good you said something, Shannon.
Yeah, because it's the rage. It's the rage.
So basically, you're just saying that the climate right now is we're just seeing rage
everywhere.
And conflict. Everything is hair triggered.
Yeah, and the widespread social media where you can't blink and you're somebody saying something awful.
That's right. Social media seems to promote awful things being said online, and that's because the way the algorithms polarize
Well, it's not even just that. The studies say that people want to engage in conflict at a higher ratio than joy, which is totally bizarre because things that are funny do really well in social media.
That's right. Yeah.
But for some bizarre reason, people respond more proactively to negative things and that's wild. So there's a human nature component that's driving the algorithm.
It's like we're wired for conflict.
Yeah,
right?
it's bizarre.
And now it's even worse because...
look at a parking lot. Parking lot's a perfect example. Or I always say like a streetcar is one of the best examples of human experience. You get on a streetcar and you see how people engage and interact with each other. It's incredible. Like how many people ignore each other, who don't get up when someone else needs to take a seat.
That's true.
Who bump in each other's way. Who there's a lot of odd, like lack of harmony that's going on that streetcar. And I find that's an example of how we are right now. There's this extraordinary lack of harmony.
And I remember when I was a young man, way back in the day, where when somebody stopped to let you through, you waved and said thank you.
Courtesy?
It's so normal.
Courtesy.
I to this day do this.
Yeah.
I will wave and go, well, thanks for that, because the traffic in Toronto is horrendous. So when people do a kindness, you respond. So I remember that way back. Not now.
That's hilarious. When I lived in Los Angeles, that was a big thing. Was because people were getting really violent on the roads and stuff.
Oh God, yes.
So people started to make eye contact and wave at each other before they would cut each other off and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Absolutely, a little proactive. Hi, love you best. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
well, it seems like there's
a
disconnect, right? Whether you're in your car or behind your computer, there is that human sort of disconnect.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the problem there, because we're not truly being together. Like we are basically, human beings are one gigantic organism. We're a symbiotic organism. We don't really fully realize that yet. And I don't think we really even know what that really means. But the sooner we all get together, and this sounds cliche, but the sooner we all get together, the stronger we will be. But there are powers out there that know this.
Yes.
And they want to keep us apart.
Yes.
Sorry, we're getting off topic here.
Yeah.
But they want to keep us apart and getting kind of driving us back onto the road of the conversation.
But
and
you're making the point, but that does
right.
make the point of Indigenous ways of being. Like when we talk about, that question about what is Indigenous identity and stuff. And I was mentioning, like I created some things around programming for First Nation communities on, in schools. And there's a massive component missing what's going on. Like, so there's a first observation going to schools is there's this, I don't know what to call it, like cliche or this sort of driving idea that teasing's a part of our way of being. And it's really not. It's absolutely not. And I've been in meetings with a lot of other Indians at the table on the reserve, and and them fighting with me, saying, "Well, kids teach each other. It's our way of being." And I look at them, like, no, it's absolutely not our way of being. No. And we need to remove this ideology from because that came out of residential schools.
Yeah.
The abusiveness and even if you can say light teasing or mean teasing, but when it gets to mean and it goes to bullying, now we have a bullying problem. And every single reserve I've worked at that in the schools, what's the first thing a principal or the director of education tells me is we have a bullying problem.
Yes.
And I feel that when I'm building the curriculum is that the reason why we have the bullying problem is because these intersectional ideas of indigeneity are cutting through our blood, like our truth. And I would bring up examples of this. There's a great film that the NFB did way back in the day. I mean, it's somewhat racist in its own, it's 1960s kind of thing. But they go out to the bush and they follow a Cree family in eastern Quebec, and it's 1974. So I love this film because the child and the 4-year-old in it is my age, the same age as me.
Oh, okay.
So it's like putting me in the context, and I'm teaching the class, and I'm like, this is not way back when. Like I'm a living fossil here. It's like,
Right.
and this 4-year-old child, because you're teaching these kids this stuff, and they're seeing the child, and they love seeing babies and themselves. These kids love seeing that type of dynamic. But the one thing that the film talks about is that these families are out there in the bush for anywhere between 6 to 8 to 9 months. Not a single fight, not a single dispute, living in the same corridors. And sometimes the 4 families will get together and they'll build a larger house. So you get to see this incredible magic occur, because how the hell did they make arrangements? Like when you think about us in those days, right? It's how did they make arrangements to meet each other at a particular location for whatever hunt or whatever season it was. This is 1974. This isn't 100 years ago.
That's right.
Right? And they went and got together, and they brought very minimal resources in terms of equipment, and they built an entire house that could house 4 families. So they built a structure all by freaking hand. Right. And so it's powerful. It's powerful. You get to see how the community worked together, how they lived in that environment, and then not a single shred of evidence of abuse occurring whatsoever. Not mothers being abusive to their children. Nobody's nagging each other about their chores. Nobody's making any complaints.
It's because everybody in the tribe or the community were considered equal. It didn't matter if you were an elder carrying the history and carrying the language, and if you look at a hierarchy at the top of the tree, it wasn't, because you can't with a circle. All is equal in the circle. There is no beginning. There is no end. And if a 3-year-old could go and pick up a piece of wood and bring it to the fire, it was considered exactly the same as an elder telling you about the history of the people. So it was never a question of who was smarter or who was greater or who was higher or who was, all of these things, because survival depended on a cohesive group of people. And it worked for tens of thousands of years, and not so much now.
But you see in the reserve systems nowadays, right? Like in the current circumstance, hierarchy plays a major role. So if you have a job and you're in the school and your family's in the school, so the eldest sister or the eldest son is going to get the first higher position in that. Not all communities are like this. I'm not driving trying to drive home cliches or anything like that, but you see certain adaptations that I consider colonial that are brought into our communities, and we're adapting those colonial things. And one of those things is abuse, right? One of those things is abusing your way forward, right? To get what you want. And I think that's what we see online when we have these arguments like about Buffy or about identity. We have these arguments, the Indian Act, another good one, right? People are divided about the Indian Act.
That's right.
People are divided about our status cards. Our status cards are a big one, right? Because now we have multiple categories of status.
Right.
Right.
And that's just increased again.
This is indigenous identity, right? Like this is it in its core. I've chosen not to have a status card. And I sometimes I regret that. Like, I not regret, but I did promise myself that the day my daughter was born, I would get my status card for her, and I still haven't done that for her. It's like, so
how do you get cheap gas then?
What's that?
So how do you get cheap gas?
I know, right? It's like, but it's
and there's that whole tax thing.
That's right.
It's a whole tax thing. But the main reason why I never did was because I never wanted to take anything from my community. So my indigeneity is not tied to my having a status card or non-status.
Well, that's a white man's card anyway, right? It's telling you who you are.
It's not at all.
No, it's a white man's card. Back in the day, sorry to interrupt,
no.
But back in the day, let's talk about the Northwest Coast. The Indian agents, who were a bunch of abusive really, really uneducated people were sent out, to count the Indians. And so they would arrive at a tribal community. Let's just use us for an example here for a minute. And one of these ignorant, don't get me started, well, I'm already started, would...
you might as well keep going.
They'd line up the Indians, and they would go, okay, Indian, no. Indian. Serious. This is absolutely the truth. Yeah, and if your family was away when they came to do the count, you were screwed for the next 200 years, because by then
you're being written out.
You're not on the rolls. And so when you go
out.
to the government, if you're not on the rolls, that means, and you weren't counted back in the day, this is like 1870, then there was no way you would ever.
Oh yeah, you have no history. You have no history.
You're not a person.
Yeah.
So this sort of Indian count is the thing that has been an underlayment of our identity, and it goes back a long, long way.
Right.
So let me share a story about my home community.
Please.
My home community is now called Curve Lake. Originally, it was called Mud Lake. It was originally settled in an area called Chemong Village, and it was done so by a group of Methodist missionaries from New England. They were called the New England Company, and they decided they were going to plant us and do all those wonderful things. And that was before the Indian Act. It was back in the 1830s, and Upper Canada was the power to be at that point. Our people saw them giving away the best land to non-Indigenous settlers, or Jacquenash. So we went to Upper Canada and said, you know what, this is not acceptable, our headmen. So the provincial government, or the government of that area, said, tell you what, instead of giving you annuities, because they gave annuities at that time, this is at the same time as the so-called Coldwater experiment, which you may be familiar with, and we can talk about if you want. But anyway, so they gave a large sum of money to pay off this missionary group, Methodist group. So we literally bought our land. When the Indian Act came in, we had to give it to the federal government because everything was controlled. So, because on reserves, the land is not owned by the individual.
Right.
It's in trust with the band, and it's federal.
Well, it's considered crown land.
Technically. Like on my reserve, I have a house. I own the house. I bought the house, but I don't own the land.
No.
Right? So here's the weird part about Mud Lake. Mud Lake decided that they wanted to join Scugog, which is a community not far from Curve Lake. And Scugog said, well, hold on a second, you guys aren't quite pure enough, because we were somewhat assimilated. A lot of Irish and Scottish blood mixed in. Curve Lake is just north of Peterborough.
Right.
So Curve Lake, Mud Lake, formed their own reserve. They became, but there were people within that community that weren't pure enough to be on the reserve, so they settled in a place called Burley Falls. And Burley Falls at one time was called the Kawartha Métis Association, Kawartha Non-Status. Now it's called the Kawartha Nishnabik. But most of their members, even their chief, because they're not recognized by the federal government, they're all Curve Lakers.
Okay.
And so that's the interesting part of my area. And the interesting part is Burley Falls is on Stony Lake. On Stony Lake, on the North Shore, is what we call the teaching routes, the petroglyphs, provincial park now, which they've conveniently covered over with plexiglass and all that sort of wild stuff. And then there's also, Burley Falls, you were talking about how we got together. Burley Falls was a place because Stony Lake didn't exist until they dammed up and created the Severn Waterway. It was a river. It was a Massasauga River. And they used to have landlocked salmon would come up through there. Eels would come in from the Atlantic because they came up that far, and our people would gather and fish. And when we fought a development that was on the Burley Bay, 700 acres, they had to do an archaeological survey, so they brought in a group from Trent University. They found artifacts that went back to 12,500 years, and they were paleo woodland. There's burial sites there that are like, they're burial sites. The archaeologist said, no, you can't call them that. And I said, why not? Well, we have to dig up bones. I said, well, kind of what we don't want you to do.
Right.
I said, that would be like me going to a church and saying there's a cemetery, but I don't know if it's really a cemetery. I have to dig up the bodies. Right. She didn't think that was funny, but it didn't matter.
Okay.
But it's true.
But that's where we got to. And like that whole area is pretty significant. There's also a creek just up past Burley Falls that goes into a lake called Lovesick, and it's called Perry Creek. And there's a series of fish weirs off that creek that are older than the one between Lake Simcoe and Couchiching at Atherley Narrows. It's 6,500 years old. So, it's interesting the way some people look at us. Like that guy that I was telling you about at Massey Hall.
Right.
A few years ago, there was a retired history teacher from Trent University, wrote an article in the local Peterborough Examiner, and he said, there were no Indigenous people in the Peterborough area until Champlain.
That is so common.
Here's the
but they call what we do revisionist history.
Yeah,
so here's the response that one of the elders from Curve Lake, Doug Williams, who's since passed. But Doug wrote an opinion piece, and he responded. He said, well, we've always been here. It's just we were really good at hiding, and you couldn't find us, And that's true, know. Like, we were Mississaugas. We were people at the river mouth. We were all across southern Ontario and even up into the, So that's our story. I think, though, and I'm going to just end with this. You guys were talking about coming together and that importance and that whole thing. Let's get back to the Buffy just for a second.
Sure.
One of the things that's really upset people is that at one time she talked, she was on Sesame Street, and she was the first Indigenous person that a lot of our Indigenous kids at that time saw. I mean, they're in the documentary they did on the CBC, right, the Seventh Estate. They show a clip where she says, I'm Cree. I've just come from my reserve, blah, blah, blah. I think there's a young guy that says, I've learned about Indians, and she said, was it a fairy tale or a true story? Because I'm a real Indian. She said that. And a lot of people identified that. It was like, oh, cool. It's the first Indigenous person that they saw on TV. And so now the repercussions of that are really bad. My hope is that, and I like to be optimistic, I think we can still come together collectively. That's always been our strength. And I hope that we all come together on this and we figure out whatever way we need to work this out, we figure it out together.
Right. And that was kind of my next question, is that how do we get past this and what's the next step? Both in, setting up, I guess, sort of maybe guidelines or some sort of policies.
Oh, my gosh.
Because we have a lot of pretendians out there now vying for different awards. There's grant applications, also just showcases and all kinds of other opportunities. So what is the solution to this problem?
Well, I'm one of those Anishinaabe that, I'm pigmentally challenged to a certain degree. I can fit in. I grew up in a very white community. I thought I was a WASP until I was 17. I grew up in King City, which Shannon used to live up in, so she knows that area. My mom denied who she was her whole life. My grandmother raised her because my grandmother went through the residential school, was gone for 6 years.
Yeah,
that's a whole different story. But she married an English guy who adopted the 3 kids that she'd had out of wedlock and adopted them, raised them here in Toronto. And in those days, in the 20s and the 30s, being Indigenous in Toronto was not something that you wanted to own up to. There was a lot of signs that said no Indians. It was like being black in the South, basically, at that time. And so my mom was raised that way. She was the oldest of the 3. My uncle was the one that became the black sheep of the family, and as my mom would say later, turned native on us, which apparently I did too. My mom would say things to me like, "Don't tell anybody that you're native," and I'm like, "Well, I'm a native artist." I think they might have figured that one out.
Right. Did she stay that way up to the end?
Funny you ask. So I'll tell 2 quick stories. I used to travel. When I first started walking this red road, I would go to every sweat that was available. I did a sweat up at Curve Lake. I was honored with the first eagle feather that I was ever gifted. I traveled from Curve Lake across 7B, which is like Port Perry and that way, to King City, because I lived in Toronto. So I went to see my folks. And I had this, I didn't expect an eagle feather, whoever does. I had wrapped it in I had some deer hide. I wrapped it in the deer hide and I put it in my bag. I get to see my folks and how, what's new? And I'm like, well, you probably don't want to know, but I was just gifted this eagle feather. And my mom said, "Can I see it?" And I'm like, okay. So I took it out and she looked at it and said, "That's not right." Well, I know it's not right because it's not covered in red cloth. It's not protected. How do you know that? She don't ask. Okay, all right. She went into the back. She said, "Is it okay if I take this for a second? I'm just gonna. I want to do something for you." So she came back with a cigar box, about that big. She had wrapped it in red velvet, and then she wrapped the cigar box in deer hide, handed it back to me. I'm like, I don't know how you know this, but
Well, bless her.
And then years later, because it was through walking this path that I got clean and sober. I had some problems with the law one time. Got to take vacations in the province, you know what I mean?
Sure. I think we've all been there one time or another.
Yeah. Well, some of us were there a few more times than we should have been.
Okay.
And at that point, I was working at Anishinaabe Health, Toronto, street patrol. I went home. And my mom pulled me aside. She said, "I don't understand this traditional path." But she said, "At least you're not in jail anymore. You seem happy." And really, it's what we taught you to do, to be kind to others and to work for your community. Because that's what my mom did. She did work with the Cancer Society and whatever else. In answer to your question, did she live that way all the time? My mom had Alzheimer's at the end of her life. And I would get phone calls. We had to put her in a secure facility because it was that bad. I couldn't have her living with me because it wasn't.
She would escape.
We were too much alike. And so I get phone calls from the nurses, and they were like, "Your mother's talking in this language that we don't know if it's gibberish or whatever." It was Anishinaabe Mohin. It was an old dialect. And I would go and I would sit with her, and she would talk to me in Anishinaabe Mohin in this old dialect that's from Curve Lake.
Wow.
She didn't know who I was half the time. Either I was her great-grandfather.
Ancient brain.
Right? And I said to a friend of mine, Albert L., who's a language teacher, I said, "How the hell does she know the language?" He said, "How old was she when she left the res or left the community?"
Right.
And I said, "She was about 6. She said, "Well, she heard that language and she's back in that." So that's my story.
Okay.
And that's kind of like, that's my answer to you. My mom is, I literally, when I was growing up, I just saw my grandmother had a really good tan.
Okay.
I ended up, I was a junior ranger back in the days Lands and Forests had that. And I was up in a place called White Lake Provincial Park. 17, hair was long, early 70s, thought I knew everything, I'd seen Jimi Hendrix play and, all those guys. But, 17, hormones kick in, and there were some girls working in this provincial park that lived in a community across the lake called Mobert, which is Pick River First Nation.
Right.
So I would walk them home, and I'd get escorted off the reserve by their fathers and brothers and whatever. But there was an old woman that looked like my grandmother. And I thought that was cool, so I started hanging out with her. And she spoke a language I didn't speak at the time. And then halfway through the summer, she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Toronto." She said, "No, where are you from?" I said,
Yeah, that's the famous indigenous.
Yeah,
Where are you from?
Yeah. And then she said, "No, where are you from?" I said, "Well, north of Toronto." And I named the town, King City. And she goes, "No." I said, "Well, I don't understand. What are you asking?" She said, "Who's your family?" Because I was a stupid white kid at that time. And now I know that she was asking. So I get home and I go, that's how I found out. I came home and I went, I was on this native reserve and this woman wanted to know who my family was. My mom said, "We don't talk about that." My grandmother lived with us. She spent her summers with my uncle out in Manitoba, who was the black sheep of the family. Ended up being an elder working with the guys in the prisons. And so that's my story. That's how I found out. And it took me a while to kind of, connect to my family back home.
Right.
I did so through a cousin who was an artist by the name of Norman Knott. And then,
Oh, I love his work.
and I
have one of his.
See, that's the fascinating part.
Yeah,
Right?
I have one of his lovely prints.
But my really fortune was meeting a guy by the name of Art Solomon. And Art was my teacher. I was his scabeus for the last few years of his life. And Art was one of those old school guys. He'd show up at like 2 a.m.
Oh, okay.
"Uncle Art, you ready?" Ready? Where are we going? Just get your stuff. Hop in his car, and we'd be beating it across the 401 in a little red Toyota. It's like, okay, Oka's on. We just passed Kingston. Are we going to Quebec? Yep. We were taking in supplies, blankets and medicines and food. I said, "We going to be okay?" "Yep." I said, "Why am I here?" "To learn and to drive me home." His home was in Sudbury. So that's what I did.
Oh, okay.
That's how I learned.
So, yeah, there's a lot of people definitely reconnecting to the culture for sure. But again, back to the whatever the next step forward is in all
Let's
this.
talk about that.
Well, if nothing else, we cannot continue to be statistics. It's so easy to count the negative statistics that have impacted Indigenous life here. And people can rhyme those off. We're 5% of the population, 33% in jail.
Right.
Those kinds of statistics. And this is how we get identified on, Canadian census, a whole bunch of things. And
Or classified, yeah.
Yeah, and we're known by all of these things. Cheap gas, cheap cigarettes, just stuff that doesn't really speak to the root of our culture, which was based on humanity, based on stories. I mean, in my language, adauch means true telling. And the stories, we don't have a word, for example, for storytellers. What we have is adauch, or true telling. And being raised on those truths was a lifesaver for me, I have to say, because and I did work in the prison system for a while with youth, Indigenous youth, and finding out that these kids knew nothing. They had no basis. They had nothing.
But that's all that education we're talking about.
Everything was just buried, and they don't know. Yeah. So I was very fortunate to be an elder in residence at the Blue Water Correctional System School in a prison in Goderich. Oh, okay. And then it was subsequently closed, and these kids were moved to Sudbury and other places. But it was an opportunity to bring in my big drums, to bring in things that they had not ever seen. And just an opportunity for them to introduce themselves. It was I learned so much from these kids. You have no idea. It was a huge learning for me as well, because you don't go in there and go, okay, here's who you are, where you're from,
Right, all ego,
and blah, blah. Yeah, you don't. You just talk, and you just let people talk. And so my whole, when I eventually go to my day of quiet, is to persevere, to be resistant, because if nothing else, we have persevered and we have been resistant to a lot of things. If we weren't, we would not be still standing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We would have been gone a long time ago. But we have a background of our ancestors who would have none of this, who went underground, like on the Northwest Coast. They call it a potlatch, which is kind of the kind of slang in my language is yauch, or feast. And they went underground when Sir Johnny. I don't use the word sir. What did I just say there? John A. Macdonald, was in power, and they took all of the ceremonies underground, and they hid them so that when the Indian agents showed up, it was this, we were based basically in Fort Simpson, but became Port Simpson in 1834. I can't believe it. We must be relatives.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier.
We have to be relatives.
That's what I was saying earlier.
What the hell? I don't know any other person who
goes, we're probably related in some
Okay, we're
way.
going to have a chat after this.
All right.
But
We'll get your DNA test.
Yeah.
Show,
See how far off we are. How many percents we're away from each other.
Cousin.
Yeah. Well, we're all cousins, right? But
absolutely.
To carry from that, like, I think for me, it's always been one thing about representation. So I've always looked at, it's the reason why I didn't want to have a status card, and I focus my energy on producing people of value that I appreciate within our communities, and focus on raising those less, how do you say, like, voiceless, right? Almost, and that's one thing that's missing. Like we're when we say about identity and stuff, like when you say a solution, I think the problem is a lot of people who are on these boards and on these selective committees and stuff like that. It's there's one part. It's like, well, do you know an Indian to see an Indian, right? Mm-hmm. We grew up in an environment where we used to nod at each other from across the road. I'd be in Seattle, or I'd be wherever, and have a guy come across, hey, Skin, hey, come here, like from way across, the other, like 2 blocks away or whatever, right? And that identity thing, it's always been in us, but I think we've been so loose and carefree about our sense of inclusion. Mm-hmm. Because we are very inclusive people, but this thing that's emerging upon taking our land, taking our laws, taking our societies, now taking our identity is getting too much.
Right.
Well, that's why I've always had a problem with truth and reconciliation, which I hope is becoming a cliche, actually. But reconciliation is not about us necessarily, because you just said it. We're an inclusive community, and I have very old stories that speak to the fact that we knew we were not going to be alone here, that others were going to come, and when they came, our best food, our best blankets, our best places to rest, and this is what we were raised with. And so if we knew you were coming, that's fine. We didn't not want you, in other words, because we knew you were coming. So what's reconciliation got to do with We knew it. So it's not about me.
Well, we're not
You
the
know.
ones reconciling.
Yeah,
That's
we're
right.
not. That's the point.
That's right.
You know, we're not
Yeah.
reconciling
Yeah,
because
and
we
then-
knew it.
And then to steal from us like our identity.
Yes.
That's like the furthest thing from reconciling anything.
Absolutely.
It's,
and we can't reconcile, and we will never reconcile if we can't get to the point where differences are accepted. That, like, we are who we are. I always I had just a quick story.
Sure.
I was doing I forgot what it was. It was years and years and years ago, and I was doing some teachings and stuff, and this very, very huge Mohawk male. I swear to God, he was 12 feet out, but he was about 6'5", just an enormous, big hands, and he came over and he went. And he stuck out his hand, which was about the size of the bass of that guitar.
Oh, wow.
And he said, "I really like your teachings, ma'am." And I went, "Gosh, I'm really glad." I'm so glad. And he stuck out his hand. You got to stick out Mike, stick out your hand just for a minute. And he taught me this handshake, which was 1,
Yep.
2, slap the forearm.
Yep.
So that in fact was the Mohawk handshake, which I had no idea.
Okay.
So he just went 1, 2,
Yeah, you got
boom, and he slapped my hand and he fell over.
His name was David Printup. No, that's who it was.
Oh, was it?
Okay.
Yeah, David Printup was one of the Mohawk warriors here in Toronto.
Okay.
I had never. Oh, anyway, he was, like up here,
Yep.
like this huge
yeah.
human being,
All right.
and it was just he never introduced himself.
No,
he just said,
that's David.
"I like your teachings, ma'am," and then stuck out his hand.
Okay.
It was like one of the best days of my life. I just loved that. That he recognizes, comes over. I mean, Anyway,
All right.
that was my little story.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, we're coming up to the end of the show. Any last comments,
Last words.
concerns, criticisms, stories?
Well, we've talked about reconciliation. I
That's
think
right.
it should be called reconciliation because it's about walking the walk, not talk the talk.
Yeah,
That's good.
Which goes back to our friend Buffy,
Right.
like quit talking the talk, walk the walk.
Yeah, just tell the truth, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
It's like
But-
crazy.
The best description I ever heard of reconciliation was Lee Miracle. Lee was in a film called Colonization Road that Michelle St. John did.
Mm-hmm.
And she was interviewed. They asked her about it. They said, well, I'll tell you what. If you step on my foot and you take your foot off mine and you say, I'm sorry, we're good. But if you step on my foot, say I'm sorry, but don't take your foot off mine, I have every right to tell you, get the hell off my foot. That's
Right.
that's the clean version of that quote. But it's true. It's you're right. We always knew people were coming, right? They say that the visitors that never left have no eyes and no ears, and maybe it's time that we open those eyes and those ears. But I think it's important that we also open our own ears and our own eyes. I think we need to really come together, and I'm hoping that this whole Buffy thing brings us together, because one of the statistics that my friend Shannon didn't quote was that we have one of the highest birth rates in Canada.
Yes,
We
we do.
and the majority of our population are under the age of 21.
Yes.
That's right. That's right.
And so to me, it goes back to that teaching about 7 generations. One of the people that maybe could have won a Juno was somebody that I know you worked with.
Right.
And I think about her, would that have made a difference to that story that was unfortunate?
Right.
There's a great book that any non-Indigenous person should read. It was written by a non-Indigenous man, a guy by the name of John Ralston Saul. His partner is Adrian Clarkson.
Oh, yeah,
It's
it's
called
just
The Comeback.
Yes, one of the best books ever.
And that is required reading for any non-Indigenous person before they jump on and start telling us how to live our lives. Because I'm sorry, you want to be an ally, but shut the hell up. Unless we ask for it. That this is something that we have to sort out. It isn't up to the non-Indigenous people to sort out. We have to figure out a better way of, and I'll close with one quick thing.
Sure.
Here in Toronto, we had the Toronto Arts Council. A few years ago, we had a woman who was on the, she was two-spirited, apparently. She claimed to be Indigenous. Her last name was Wong. I'm sorry, but I forget her first name. She was one of the owners of Glad Day Bookstore. She used to represent us at demonstrations. Mm-hmm. She was on the board for, and they outed her. And they had a circle. She asked for a circle. The weird thing is that there are Indigenous people that will say things that, from a traditional standpoint, you gotta kind of wonder. There was a traditional elder that was there. She was a two-spirit elder. And one of the complaints they had was that this young woman was doing ceremonies. If you're not who you claim to be, you can't do ceremonies, can't do sweat lodge, can't do that. And this elder said, if I think I don't care what race they are, if I've taught them and I think they're ready, they can do that. Well, that's not quite the way I understand it, but, maybe that's her understanding. Again, her truth. But that really hurt this community here in Toronto. And it was, there were people like Jesse Wente who stepped away from the Toronto Arts Council because of it, And I respect Jesse, by the way. I think he's an amazing person. I think we need to stick together. That's
Absolutely.
really what it boils down to.
That's right. Well, thank you. Yeah.
It's interesting because, the common thing is that we shouldn't be the one fixing their problems, but we're always the ones fixing their problems.
That's right.
And so we have the checkbox there. We want to have Indigenous categories. We want to have people recognized for their work, their exploits, all of that stuff. But how do we, with the lack of policing, you know what I mean, without it being like that, how do we go through that process? And the common thing that I've been hearing now that's coming up is about placemaking. Like what is your origin, what's your location, and stuff like that. I don't know if those are going to be the answers, because they're suggesting things like, do you have at least 2 or 3 Indigenous people to vouch for you?
Right.
I heard
especially
that,
when you apply for the Juno category, you have to provide 2 references, as well as you have to write basically an essay on how you give back to the community. Now, if you apply to the hip hop category or to the rock and roll category, they're not going to ask you for an essay how you give back to the community.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing, right? So I mean, to what length?
Right. Exactly.
Is that going to do? And the other part is, do we look at it if there's more frauds to come about? I mean, there's still quite a few
There is. There is. And after the show, we'll run a list of them after in the credits.
And it's like
maybe not.
No, maybe not.
Because you were just, as you were saying earlier, right, about being quiet. Because I remember being in, speaking generationally again.
Right.
Is that we sort of put up with it. I remember seeing white people dressed up, like I said, in powwow regalia and stuff, and I'd look at elders and stuff, and they'd just be like, "Meh, whatever."
Have you ever been to? Have you ever been to Germany?
That's right. They have a whole thing there in Germany.
Okay,
that's right.
Okay, I know we have to end.
Yeah.
Just a little.
We'll give you the last word, Shannon.
A little quick one.
Okay.
There was a man in the 20s called Karl May.
Yeah.
And he wrote these very fanciful stories about Canadian Indigenous people.
Okay.
And they basically became like the Nancy Drew books all across Europe. And he was, a German guy. Or was he Dutch? I can't remember. Anyway, it was German. One or the other. And I was invited to Germany, to the University of Marburg, to do some lectures. And speaking of being treated like a rock star, it was hilarious. Just wow. But they grew up on these fanciful stories, so they've got this big park like Dollywood in the Black Forest where people can go and watch I can't remember the names. There's a native guy and the white guy on a horse as they move around each other like this, and they're, trying to communicate. And then it's a huge, huge thing. And what they didn't want to hear was anything to do with residential schools, the Indian Act,
authenticity.
Oh, yeah, well, they didn't want the real story because millions of people had grown up on Karl May's romance of Canada's Indigenous people. And that's why the Germans came over here in hordes and took back teepees. They bought all kinds of stuff and took back teepees and all sorts of things.
They actually dress up like
and
us.
they dress up.
Right.
Yeah.
There's
they
a
have their own
documentary
powwows and stuff too.
Yeah.
There's a documentary Drew Hayden did
Yes,
on that.
that's
It's
right. Yeah, that's
amazing.
It's an amazing.
They
it is.
did a series of movies based on the books too.
Yeah.
And I forget the character's name, but
Yeah.
Right.
I think Kent Monkman used them in an art installation where they kind of like. Anyway,
Yeah. All right.
let's close her up.
Yeah,
great.
in short, I guess we're saying that there's a big problem here, and we don't know what to do.
No, it doesn't seem like It doesn't seem like we'll figure out a solution today.
Yeah.
In the last 90 minutes we've
Another,
been talking.
just to say, you need to see us.
Right.
See me.
Right.
I see you. See me.
Yeah,
And just.
And we should be calling out more pretendians, people claiming to be us.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
God, they're legion.
I think the whole hunting and the whole thing about like the stigma of questioning someone's identity, the stigma should be gone. Like I don't give a shit. Like it doesn't happen to me.
Right.
Like literally maybe 2 times in my entire freaking life have I had somebody go like, "Really? Are you?" One was a white woman in Vancouver because I was selling native stuff on the street, and she was like, "You don't look Indian, like not from." And I goes, "Well, I'm not from here." It's like, and then another one was a Blackfoot buddy of mine. He used to do that to me. He'd be like, "I don't know what the fuck you are," but it was just like, kind of like, but it was like, that was typical of the Blackfoot because they would always tease me. There's no reserve in Calgary. Where are you from? There was no reserve.
Right.
I guess unless we're wearing moccasins and buckskin and big, huge Lakota headdresses, we're not recognized.
Yeah. But that's the thing. Like,
But that's always been though.
Yeah, I know.
Even when I worked in the community, I had people that I worked with that knew me, knew my family, and they would go, the reason that you're on the Speaker's Bureau for the United Way is because you look whiter than I do. And that's always been the story, right? Do we have a solution? Yeah, I think we do. We just need to do it. And there are people that are out there on a constant basis outing pretend Indians.
Yes, there are.
We have a woman that's being outed now that was somebody I have respect for, that's a social worker here in our community. Is she? I don't know. I thought she was, but like Buffy,
Right.
I think Buffy's lived this life for 60 years and actually believes her own bullshit.
I think that too. I think she's maybe delusional, and there's some sort of cognitive mechanism
And I
broken
know
there.
I'm going to
but
take some hits for that last comment, but that's
But we also have to be careful because I think it's going to start a whole outing of pretendians, and it could get really ugly.
It could, yes.
Particularly if you're being accused and you're not a pretendian. So
yeah,
we
no,
have
that's
to
what I
be-
mean. Like there's this line,
Yeah,
right?
So we have to
There's
really
this
be
line.
careful about. I think he wants to shut us down.
Yeah,
we
I
can
think
sit
so.
here for the rest of the day.
We're going to run out of tape here. We don't have tape. It's digital.
I know.
But at some point we have to wrap it up.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you,
Been an
KJ,
honor.
Shannon, and Mike. And yeah, we don't really have a solution, but I think it's up to us in our individual circles of influence to move forward, and that's how we're going to create
solution right there.
Yes.
Exactly, you got it.
That's it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
It's been fun.
Toyach.
All right, thank you for watching.